Born amidst the humble beginnings of Kirkwood, Illinois, in 1941, Richard Benjamin Speck emerged into the world. The seventh child in a household of 8, his early years were woven into the fabric of a typical Midwestern family life, under the watchful eyes of Benjamin Franklin Speck and Mary Margaret Carbaugh. The family soon moved to Monmouth, Illinois, raised in a household anchored by his mother's devout religiosity and abstention from alcohol, contrasted starkly against his father's earthy professions as a farmer, logger, and later, a packer at Western Stoneware. Tragedy first brushed Speck's life at the tender age of 6 when his father succumbed to a heart attack, a pivotal moment that reportedly forged a deep bond between father and son, though posthumously. The void left by his father's death was soon filled by Carl August Rudolph Lindbergh, whom his mother wed in 1950 following a meeting en route to Chicago. Lindbergh, a figure shadowed by a questionable past and a penchant for the bottle, stood in stark contrast to the memory of Speck's father, introducing an element of discord into the young boy's life. The family relocated to East Dallas marked the onset of a nomadic lifestyle, with Speck's formative years marred by a succession of homes within impoverished neighborhoods, a reflection of their ever-shifting fortunes. It was here that the young Speck's disdain for his stepfather, an often drunk and absentee figure, took root, sowing seeds of unrest that would burgeon into a tumultuous adolescence. Speck's academic journey was fraught with challenges, exacerbated by his nearsightedness and a struggle to attention, culminating in his eventual departure from Shoal after years of academic struggles. His descent into delinquency was punctuated by alcoholism, initiating a cycle of petty crimes that ensnared him within the judicial system's grasp. The early 60s heralded a brief interlude of domesticity for Speck, with his marriage to 15-year-old Shirley Annette Malone and the subsequent birth of their daughter, Robbie Lynn. However, this semblance of stability was short-lived, as Speck's incarcerations for forgery, burglary, and assault soon resumed, each conviction further entrenching him within a lifestyle punctuated by crime and sporadic employment. By 1965, Speck's life had spiraled into a chaotic succession of events, marked by brief incarcerations, fleeting jobs, and an eventual estrangement from Malone. His return to Dallas only heralded further turmoil, culminating in a pivotal moment when, faced with impending arrest, Speck fled to Chicago, seeking refuge and perhaps a new beginning amidst the familiar yet distant embrace of family. Speck's time in Monmouth, Illinois, rekindled connections with his past, yet his presence seemed to cast a shadow, as the town became the backdrop for a series of disturbing incidents, including a brutal assault on a local resident and the mysterious death of a barmaid. These events, coupled with Speck's subsequent disappearance from Monmouth, painted a foreboding picture of a man on the precipice of something far more sinister. Chicago welcomed Speck with the promise of anonymity and a fresh start. Nestled within his sister Martha's family home, Speck entertained fleeting aspirations towards a maritime career, an ambition curtailed by health issues and personal demons. His life, a patchwork of transient dwellings, brief connections, and unfulfilled ambitions, seemed to be in perpetual motion, with each step drawing him inexorably towards a fate that would etch his name into the annals of criminal infamy. As Speck navigated the streets of Chicago, his path crossed with the National Maritime Union, a stone's throw from a residence that housed young student nurses. Unbeknownst to them, their lives were about to intersect with Speck's in a way that would leave an indelible mark on the city's history, setting the stage for a night of unimaginable horror. The disparate threads of Speck's tumultuous life were converging, and the stage was set for an act of brutality that would shock a nation and immortalize Richard Benjamin Speck as one of the most notorious figures in American criminal lore. While awaiting his trial, Richard Speck became the subject of a comprehensive mental evaluation orchestrated by felony court judge Herbert J. Passion. An unbiased team was assembled to assess Speck's mental state and his ability to stand trial, including psychiatrists nominated by both the defense and prosecution. This panel, after thorough deliberation, declared Speck fit for trial and deemed that he was sane during the time of the heinous acts he was accused of committing. During this period, Speck engaged in regular consultations with Dr. Marvin Zipperin, a psychiatrist working part-time at Cook County Jail. These sessions, which commenced post his transfer from Cermak Memorial Hospital and continued until the day before his move to Peoria for the trial, unearthed a range of emotions in Speck, from guilt and shame to a pronounced affection for his family. Zipperen's observations suggested Speck harbored an obsessive-compulsive personality, coupled with a skewed perception of women, veering from reverence to hostility upon feeling betrayed. Further complicating Speck's psychological profile was a diagnosis of organic brain syndrome attributed to past cerebral injuries, which, according to Zipperen, rendered Speck incapable of sanity at the time of the murders due to alcohol and drug-induced exacerbation of his condition. However, Dr. Zipperen's potential testimony became a point of contention for both legal teams when it was revealed that he was penning a book about Speck, presumably for profit. This revelation led to Zipperen's dismissal from his role at Cook County Jail and raised ethical questions about his interactions with Speck, particularly the acquisition of a written consent from Speck permitting Zipperen to discuss his true nature. Despite these controversies, Zipperen's book on Speck saw publication in the summer following the trial. Speck, for his part, oscillated between denial and admission regarding the murders. Initially, he claimed amnesia concerning the events, a stance supported by a confession made under sedation to Dr. Leroy Smith, which went unused during the trial due to its circumstances. However, over the years, Speck's narrative evolved, culminating in a public admission during a 1978 interview with Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene and a detailed recounting in a prison-made film in 1988. Wherein Speck acknowledged his sobriety during the crimes, challenging the notion of drug influence as a mitigating factor. The trial itself, which commenced on April 3, 1967, in Peoria, Illinois, was marked by stringent press restrictions. A pivotal moment came when Corazon Amureo, the sole survivor, unequivocally identified Speck as the perpetrator in a dramatic courtroom confrontation. This, along with fingerprint evidence, solidified the case against Speck. After less than an hour of deliberation, the jury convicted Speck, recommending capital punishment. This sentence, however, was subject to an automatic appeal process which saw Speck's death penalty overturned due to procedural issues related to jury selection, as mandated by a subsequent Supreme Court ruling. An intriguing twist in Speck's legal narrative involved the debunked hypothesis of XYY syndrome, a condition once erroneously associated with violent behavior due to an extra Y chromosome. Initial speculation, fueled by scientific and media conjecture, suggested that Speck might exhibit this genetic anomaly, potentially influencing his violent tendencies. However, comprehensive chromosome testing confirmed Speck's normal XY karyotype, discrediting the theory as a factor in his case. Ultimately, the revocation of the death penalty in the Furman v. Georgia case necessitated Speck's resentencing, which culminated in a prison term ranging from 400 to 1,200 years, later adjusted to 100 to 300 years. While serving his sentence at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, Richard Speck earned the nickname Birdman, reminiscent of the film Birdman of Alcatraz. This moniker was due to his unusual pastime of caring for a couple of sparrows that had ventured into his cell. Despite his grim past, inside the prison walls, Speck was somewhat of a mystery. He was known to be a solitary figure who occupied his time with hobbies such as stamp collecting and listening to music. His interactions with the prison warden were mundane, mostly requests for new shirts or radio, leading the warden to describe him as a big nothing doing time. Despite his seemingly harmless activities, Speck was far from a model inmate. He was frequently found in possession of drugs or homemade alcohol. His defiant attitude towards the consequences of these infractions was summed up in his own words: "How am I going to get in trouble? I'm here for 1,200 years." This statement highlighted Speck's resigned attitude toward his lengthy sentence and his disregard for prison rules. Speck's disdain extended to the media as well. He rarely interacted with reporters and only granted a single press interview in 1978 to Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene. In this rare public confession, Speck admitted to the murders for the first time. He harbored a delusional hope of being released between now and the year 2000, aspiring to run a grocery store. When asked to compare himself to infamous criminals like John Dillinger, Speck asserted his uniqueness, stating, "Me, I'm not like Dillinger or anybody else. I'm freakish. During the interview, Speck reflected on his state of mind during the murders, claiming he had no feelings that night and expressed regret, stating, "I'm sorry as hell. For those girls, and for their families, and for me. If I had to do it over again, it would be a simple house burglary." His parting message to the American public was a request to maintain their hatred for him, which he claimed bolstered his morale. An incident shared by John E. Douglas of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in his book Mindhunter further illustrated Speck's cold nature. Speck once nurtured a wounded sparrow back to health, only to kill it in front of a guard by throwing it into a fan when told pets were not allowed, showing a glimpse into his lack of empathy. In May 1996, a prison video emerged, showcasing Speck's life behind bars in a way the public had never seen. The video, aired by Chicago television news anchor Bill Curtis, revealed explicit scenes of Speck engaging in sexual acts, drug use, and boasting about his comfortable life in prison. His transformation, which included developing female-like breasts purportedly through smuggled hormone treatments, shocked many. The video also captured Speck admitting to the murders in a casual manner, further cementing his infamy. Speck's life came to an end just before his 50th birthday, in December 1991. After being taken to Silver Cross Hospital in Joliet, Illinois, for severe chest pains, Speck succumbed to what was believed to be a heart attack. The autopsy revealed significant health issues, including an enlarged heart and clogged arteries, which likely contributed to his death. Given the disgusting human being Speck was, his sister opted for cremation to prevent any desecration of his grave, and his ashes were scattered in a secret location in the Joliet area, bringing an end to the dark tale of Richard Speck. What's your thoughts on the life and crimes of Richard Speck? Comment below to let us know what you think. On a seemingly ordinary Friday, July 8, 1966, Richard Speck's journey towards infamy subtly began as his brother-in-law, Gene, escorted him to the National Maritime Union hiring hall. Speck was hopeful to secure a spot on a ship, but fate had other plans. Despite his anticipation, a more senior seaman was chosen for a berth on the SS Flying Spray, a cargo ship destined for South Vietnam. Disappointed, Speck retreated to his sister Martha's apartment to regroup over the weekend. By Monday, July 11th, the tide of Speck's welcome at his sister's home had begun to end. Packed and ready, Gene once again played chauffeur, dropping Speck off at the NMU hiring hall with hopes pinned on securing a berth. However, that night, Speck found refuge at Pauline's rooming house, a modest establishment nestled about a mile away in the Vets Park neighborhood of South Deering, Chicago. The following day, Speck's fortunes seemed to momentarily turn as he was assigned to the SS Sinclair Great Lakes, a tanker under Sinclair Oil, stationed a short drive away in East Chicago, Indiana. Yet, upon arrival, Speck discovered the cruel twist of fate. His spot had already been filled. With no spot and the hiring hall closed, Speck was left to fend for himself, ultimately finding a makeshift bed in an unfinished house on the outskirts of the city. The dawn of Wednesday, July 13th, saw Speck retrieve his belongings and make another attempt at the NMU hiring hall, his frustration mounting over the previous day's wild goose chase. A brief encounter with his sister and brother-in-law provided a temporary solace before Speck decided to abandon the wait for work. With $25 from his sister, he ventured to the Shipyard Inn, a rooming house in East Side, Chicago, seeking shelter for the night. The day spiraled into a blur of taverns and alcohol, culminating in a sinister turn when Speck, under the cover of darkness and emboldened by intoxication, preyed upon Ella Mae Hooper, a 53-year-old woman. The encounter led to a horrific act of violence in his room at the Shipyard Inn, where Speck assaulted Hooper, but also stole her .22 caliber pistol. Cloaked in black and armed with newfound vigor, Speck vanished into the night, his steps leading him inexorably towards a dreadful destiny. The quiet of the night on 2319 East 100th Street in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood was shattered as Speck, fueled by a toxic cocktail of alcohol and drugs, forced his way into the townhouse serving as a dormitory for student nurses. What unfolded was a nightmarish tableau of brutality as Speck, wielding nothing but a knife, methodically killed 8 innocent women. The nurses, Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Mary Ann Jordan, Merlita Gargullo, and Valentina Passion, fell victim to Speck's unbridled savagery. The ordeal spanned hours, with Speck leading his victims one by one to their tragic end, the final act marked by the rape and murder of Gloria Davy. In a twist of fate, Corazon Amureo, a ninth nurse and a guest that fateful night, eluded death by mere inches, her salvation found beneath a bed, a silent witness to the horror that unfolded around her. It was not until the first light of dawn that Amureo dared emerge, the lone survivor, in a night of horror. The grim discovery of fingerprints at the crime scene soon led to Speck, whose past was littered with minor transgressions, but nothing that foretold the magnitude of July 13th's events. The subsequent identification by a drifter named Claude Lunsford, who had crossed paths with Speck in the days following the massacre, set the wheels of justice in motion. However, it was Speck's own brush with death, a failed suicide attempt at the Star Hotel, that ultimately led to his capture. Recognized by a young doctor at Cook County Hospital, Speck's arrest on July 17 marked the end of his fleeting freedom but the beginning of a saga that would delve deep into the darkest recesses of human nature. In the shadow of the recent Miranda decision, authorities tread cautiously, delaying Speck's interrogation for weeks. Yet, the weight of evidence and the horror of his acts would soon bring Richard Speck to account for the lives he callously stole on that fateful summer night in 1966. In the quiet early hours of March 13, 1964, the streets of the Kew Gardens neighborhood in Queens, New York, bore witness to a horrifying event that would later resonate through the corridors of psychology and criminology. Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old bartender with dreams larger than life, became the victim of a brutal attack right outside her apartment building. This tragic event not only claimed her life but also ignited a widespread debate on what later came to be known as the bystander effect, often referred to in academic circles as Genovese syndrome. The public's understanding of the incident was initially shaped by a New York Times article published 2 weeks after Genovese's murder. The article controversially claimed that 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack, yet none took action to assist Genovese or contact law enforcement. This chilling narrative of apathy amidst a young woman's desperate cries for help shocked the nation and spurred inquiries into the psychological phenomenon of bystander inaction. However, subsequent investigations and reports have unveiled significant discrepancies in the New York Times' account of that fateful night. Not only did researchers and competing journalists uncover that the figure of 38 witnesses was grossly inflated, but they also found evidence that contradicted the claim of complete inaction by the witnesses. In reality, several attempts were made to reach out to the police, challenging the narrative of indifference that had been widely accepted. Decades later, even the Times itself acknowledged the flaws in its original reporting, admitting that the story had exaggerated the number of witnesses and misrepresented their responses to the crime. The case took a significant turn when, 6 days post-murder, Winston Moseley, a 29-year-old Manhattan resident, was apprehended for a separate burglary. During his time in custody, Moseley shockingly confessed to the murder of Kitty Genovese. His subsequent trial led to a guilty verdict, and Moseley was initially sentenced to death, a punishment later commuted to life imprisonment. Moseley's long tenure in prison ended with his death in 2016, after serving 52 years behind bars. Kitty Genovese's life prior to that night painted a picture of a vibrant, determined young woman. Born in Brooklyn to Italian-American parents, Kitty was the eldest of 5 siblings. She grew up in a tight-knit community predominantly made up of Italian and Irish-American families. Known for her mature confidence and bright personality, Kitty navigated her school years with a sense of assurance rare for her age. Despite a brief marriage that ended due to societal pressures and her own sexual orientation, Kitty's spirit remained undeterred. After the dissolution of her marriage, Kitty ventured into the working world, initially taking up clerical jobs, which she found mundane. Her life took a more fulfilling turn when she entered the hospitality industry, eventually managing a bar despite a minor legal hiccup involving an arrest for bookmaking. Kitty's aspirations weren't confined to her bartending duties. She dreamt of opening her own Italian restaurant, a dream supported by her savings from working double shifts. Kitty's personal life was shared with Mary and Zielonko, her girlfriend since 1963, in their shared apartment in Kew Gardens. Their life together was cut tragically short by the events of March 1964. In the dark, early hours of March 13, 1964, Kitty Genovese concluded her shift at the bar and embarked on her journey home in her red Fiat. As she paused at a red light on Hoover Avenue, her presence was noted by Winston Moseley, who sat in his Chevrolet Corvair, observing her from the shadows. Kitty arrived at her residence around 3:15 a.m., parking her car not far from her apartment's entrance in an alleyway adjacent to the building. Unbeknownst to her, Moseley had trailed her home, and upon her exit from the vehicle, he emerged from his parked car, armed and determined. As Kitty walked toward her building, Moseley made his move, quickly overtaking her and inflicting 2 deep wounds with his hunting knife. Kitty's screams for help, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Help me!" pierced the quiet night, reaching the ears of several neighbors. The gravity of her cries was lost on many, but not all. A neighbor, Robert Moser, intervened with a shout, causing Moseley to momentarily retreat, giving Kitty a fleeting chance to move toward the safety of her building. However, her injuries were severe, and she remained hidden from view, beyond the reach of potential aid. Moseley wasn't deterred for long. He returned to the scene after 10 minutes, his face obscured by a hat, and began a meticulous search. His persistence led him to Kitty, who lay in a back hallway of the building, weakened and defenseless. Beyond the sight of the street and isolated from any potential aid, Moseley resumed his attack with ferocity, assaulting Kitty further before fleeing with $49. The ordeal, which unfolded over 30 agonizing minutes, left Genovese with defensive wounds on her hands, a testament to her desperate fight for survival. It was Sophia Farrar, a neighbor and dear friend, who discovered Kitty in the aftermath, offering comfort in her final moments with the assurance that help was on its way. Sadly, assistance arrived too late, and Kitty succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital. The response from law enforcement to the early calls was marked by ambiguity and a lack of urgency, an issue compounded by the absence of a centralized emergency call system, which wouldn't be implemented in New York City for another 4 years. Accounts vary, with one witness recounting an early call to the police following the initial assault, and another, Carl Ross, seeking counsel from friends before finally contacting the authorities. By the time an ambulance was dispatched, it was 4:15 a.m., but the effort to save Kitty Genovese was in vain. She was laid to rest on March 16, 1964, in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan, Connecticut. On the morning following Kitty Genovese's tragic death, her partner, Mary Ann Zielonko, found herself under the intense scrutiny of Detective Mitchell Sang. The inquiry, which began at 7 a.m., extended for 6 hours, with detectives John Carroll and Jerry Burns probing deeply into the nature of Zielonko's relationship with Genovese. The police's line of questioning, focused on the personal dynamics between the two women, also extended to their neighbors, casting an initial shadow of suspicion on Zielonko herself. The breakthrough in the case came on March 19, 6 days post the harrowing incident, with the apprehension of Winston Moseley. His arrest was prompted by a robbery suspicion in Ozone Park, where he was caught transporting a television set, later discovered in his car's trunk. The arrest followed the vigilance of Roel Cleary, who, upon noticing Moseley's suspicious activity, challenged his claim of being a mover. Doubts further solidified after consultation with Jack Brown, another neighbor, who confirmed the homeowners were not relocating. In a bid to stall Moseley until the authorities' arrival, Brown ingeniously disabled Moseley's vehicle. A detective, recalling witness reports of a white car similar to Moseley's near the scene of Genovese's murder, directed detectives Carroll and Sang to investigate the connection. Under interrogation, Moseley shockingly confessed to the brutal killing of Genovese and 2 additional women, Annie Mae Johnson, found deceased and burned in her apartment, and 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, murdered in her home. This confession not only linked Moseley to the Genovese case but also to a series of violent crimes, shedding light on a pattern of deadly assaults. Winston Moseley, a 29-year-old Ozone Park resident and employee at Remington Rand, led a normal life as a family man with no prior criminal record. His role involved handling punched cards for data input, a task crucial in the era's computing processes. However, behind this facade lurked a sinister predilection for violence. In his confession, Moseley chillingly recounted his urge to kill a woman, driven by a perverse belief that women were vulnerable targets. He detailed the premeditated nature of his nocturnal prowling, seeking out Genovese as she made her way home in the early hours. Moseley's admissions not only included the murder of Genovese but extended to the sexual assault and murder of 2 other women, alongside a spree of burglaries. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during Moseley's custody painted a grim portrait of his psychological state, suggesting tendencies towards necrophilia. This disturbing insight into Moseley's mind underscored the chilling disconnect between his outwardly ordinary life and the darkness that drove him to commit such heinous acts. Moseley stood trial for the murder of Kitty Genovese in June 1964, amidst a cloud of public outrage and media frenzy. Although Moseley had confessed to this heinous crime and 2 others, he was solely tried for Genovese's murder, complicating the legal proceedings due to a concurrent confession from another individual, Alvin Mitchell, for one of the murders Moseley claimed. As the trial unfolded under Judge J. Erwin Shapiro's gavel, Moseley initially entered a plea of not guilty. However, in a strategic turn, his defense pivoted to insanity, hoping to navigate the murky waters of criminal responsibility and mental health. Moseley himself took the stand, recounting the chilling details of that fateful night, alongside a litany of other crimes he had committed. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict, sealing Moseley's fate to a chorus of approval from the courtroom audience. Moseley's sentencing to death initially saw no reaction from him, a stark contrast to the emotional outpouring from the courtroom spectators. Judge Shapiro's personal disdain for capital punishment was momentarily set aside in light of the monstrous nature of Moseley's actions, expressing a willingness to enact the sentence himself. In a twist of fate, Moseley later testified in Mitchell's trial, admitting to the murder of Barbara Kralik under the protection of immunity. Despite a hung jury in Mitchell's first trial, a conviction was secured in the subsequent one. The legal saga took another turn in 1967 when the New York Court of Appeals intervened, mandating that Moseley should have been granted the opportunity to argue medical insanity at his sentencing, leading to a commutation of his death sentence to life imprisonment. Moseley's time in incarceration was marked by a daring escape in 1968, during which he inflicted violence and terror on innocent people, further extending his sentence. His involvement in the 1971 Attica prison riot, academic pursuits, and numerous parole hearings punctuated his decades-long imprisonment. Despite his claims of victimhood and attempts to downplay the gravity of his crimes, parole boards repeatedly denied Moseley's release, unmoved by his lack of remorse and the ongoing suffering of Genovese's family. Moseley died in 2016. The murder of Kitty Genovese initially flew under the media radar until a casual comment by NYPD Commissioner Michael J. Murphy to the New York Times editor A.M. Rosenthal led to a groundbreaking story. The Times article, penned by Martin Gansberg and laden with inaccuracies, claimed 38 witnesses did nothing to help Genovese, coining the term bystander effect. This narrative painted a bleak picture of urban apathy, particularly in New York, and became emblematic of societal indifference. Cultural figures like Harlan Ellison amplified this narrative, depicting the 38 witnesses as passive observers to Genovese's brutal demise. However, subsequent examinations revealed the story's complexity. Kevin Cook, in a 2014 NPR interview, disclosed inconsistencies in the witness count, suggesting that a bureaucratic mix-up might have inflated the numbers, entrenching the myth in American history. The case spurred psychological inquiry into why people might not intervene in emergencies. Harold Takushian noted the irony in behavioral scientists' inability to explain bystander behavior when the murderer's own justification was chillingly simple: he expected no intervention from the onlookers. Psychologist Francis Cherry argued that the case also highlighted gender dynamics and bystander intervention, suggesting that societal norms might deter intervention in what appears to be a domestic dispute. The Genovese case became a staple in social psychology, illustrating the bystander effect through the lens of diffusion of responsibility. This theory posits that the presence of multiple bystanders dilutes the sense of individual responsibility to act. Yet, further scrutiny, particularly a 2007 American Psychologist article, challenged the factual basis of this narrative, revealing it to be more myth than reality, a result of the Times' flawed reporting. More recent investigations have further unraveled the original story. A 2004 New York Times article on the murder's 40th anniversary questioned the claim of 38 inactive witnesses. A 2007 study found no evidence to support the presence of so many witnesses or their inaction. The Times, in 2016, acknowledged the flaws in its initial reporting, clarifying the exaggerated witness count and the witnesses' perceptions of the attack. Subsequent police investigations revealed that only a dozen people might have partially witnessed the attack, with many unaware of its severity, mistaking it for a less serious incident. This nuanced understanding challenges the original narrative, shedding light on the complexities of human behavior and the constraints of perception in emergency situations. A 2015 documentary further questioned the original narrative, uncovering that discrepancies were known among crime reporters soon after the murder. Yet, these findings were not pursued, likely due to the hesitance to challenge the narrative set by a powerful figure like Rosenthal. This reflection on journalistic ethics underscores the profound impact of media narratives on public perception and policy. The Genovese murder also catalyzed the creation of the 911 emergency call system, highlighting the need for a centralized number for emergencies, a significant legacy of this tragic event. The story, despite its inaccuracies, has been deeply ingrained in psychology, media, and public safety discussions, serving as a cautionary tale about the complexities of human behavior, the power of media narratives, and the evolution of public safety infrastructure.